talk about motivation and emotion. And you'll see when you look at the chapter that I'm doing this a little bit out of order. I thought what we do today is talk about the basic theories of motivation and basic theories of emotion and how we experience emotion. And then on Wednesday, when I come back, I'm going to talk about some specific motivated behaviors. Specifically, I'll talk about hunger, eating disorders, sex, and mate selection on Wednesday. So today we're going to get the basics out of the way, do the theories, and lay some foundations for talking about motivated behaviors on Wednesday. So if you find that you're really interested in these motivated behaviors, there is an upper level class that talks almost exclusively about things like body weight regulation and sex and drug abuse and those sorts of things that fall under motivated behaviors. So that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So motivation, we know, is closely tied to emotion. And when we think about motivation, we can think of it as a set of factors that initiate and direct behavior. Okay? We have both internal factors that motivate us to behave in a certain way, and we're also influenced by external factors. Okay? So you can think about how your peers influence you, how your teachers influence you, and that sort of thing, and how they may act to change your behaviors. Okay? So just as we are interested in understanding how the brain works, remember in Chapter 3 we talked about neuronal signaling and those sorts of things, with motivation what we aim to do is understand why we behave the way that we do, okay? And maybe predict how we're going to behave the next time. So with motivation we aim to understand the initiation of behavior, the direction of behavior, the intensity of that behavior, how intense is your drive or your need to complete that behavior, and also the persistence of a behavior. So we have several sources of motivation, and psychologists try to draw on all of these sources of motivation in order to develop theories of why we behave the way that we do. So we have biological factors, so things like hunger and thirst and temperature regulation that may drive our behaviors. We have emotional factors. So if you feel happy, if you feel angry, if you feel scared, it may change the way that you behave, the behaviors that you engage in. We also have cognitive factors that are involved in why we behave the way that we do. So we have a certain set of beliefs about our own abilities and how our abilities might be perceived by others that influence the way that we act. For example, if you thought you were a great singer, it might make you more likely to sign up for a talent show versus somebody who thinks they're a terrible singer, they would never sign up for a talent show. Okay? So how we believe, what we believe about our own abilities influences how we behave as well. And there are also social factors that influence how we behave and why we do what we do. Okay, so I'm guessing that some of you have probably purchased a shirt or type of shoes or gotten your hair cut a certain way because of the influence of other people, right? So social factors influence what we do as well. So a number of theories have been developed on motivation, and they attempt to draw in a number of these factors. None of them is complete, but they all have important components to try to understand why we behave the way that we do. Okay. So in the early 1900s, there was a lot of interest in trying to understand whether or not we behave the way we do because of instinct. Okay. So this is a theory that explains human behavior as motivated by automatic, involuntary, and unlearned responses. Okay. So you can think about instincts in animals. Specifically, a lot of work has been done studying birds. Birds know how to build a nest without ever having been shown. They know to migrate when the weather changes. They know how to do complex mating dances without ever having learned those things. So we think of those behaviors as instincts. Okay? So we call these fixed action patterns. So these are innate biological forces that predispose an organism to behave in a certain way. Okay? And so, again, in the early 1900s, there was a lot of thought about whether or not humans have instincts. Okay, and at that time, a number of instincts were described, but there was some controversy related to that because really what we were describing was behaviors. And the view now is that there's not a lot of evidence for instincts in humans. Okay? Much of what we do is learned. All right, so theories of motivation. If we think of theories of motivation in terms of drive, we can think about biological processes. Okay? So we have a drive to maintain what's called homeostasis. And homeostasis is, you can think about it as an optimal way for your body to function. Okay, so if you think about it in terms of feeding, so one thing that we have a strong drive to do is to keep our blood glucose levels at an optimum level. When our blood glucose levels drop too low, we're driven to seek food and consume food to bring our glucose levels back to a normal level. Okay? And this is homeostasis, so it's our optimal level for functioning. Okay? So with drive, this is a psychological state that arises in response to an internal physiological need, and what we need to do is figure out what behavior we have to engage in to meet that need. So whether it's we're thirsty, we're hungry, whether our body temperature is too high or too low, we have a biological drive to get back to our set optimum point, which is our homeostatic point. So oftentimes you see homeostasis in terms of thinking about a temperature regulation, okay? And what we have when we are talking about homeostasis is equilibrium. So when we have a drive to restore equilibrium, what happens is it's unbalanced. We have the need, so a biological need to correct that unbalanced equilibrium, okay? We then engage in a behavior to satisfy the need. Okay, so we eat food, or we drink water, or we change our temperature. You put on a sweater, you turn the air conditioning on, whatever it is you're trying to regulate, and then we restore equilibrium. So the drive reduction theory says that the reason that we engage in certain behaviors is to maintain this equilibrium that is optimal for us. Our next theory of motivation is arousal. And arousal theory is based on the idea that we all have an optimal level of arousal that we need to function at our best. Okay. So this this theory takes into account things beyond biological needs. So you can think, how many of you have ever tried skydiving before? Okay, a couple of you. How many of you think skydiving would just be something that you would never ever do? Okay, and whether or not you would choose to do something this extreme is based on your need for arousal. Okay, some of us do a lot better when we're highly aroused, and some of us can't handle that level of arousal at all. So what we seek to do is to engage in behaviors that will get us to our optimal level of arousal. Okay. So when we have our arousal is too high, we seek ways to decrease it. So if somebody's got you on that plane and they're about to push you out so you can skydive, and you hold on for dear life and do everything you can not to go out if that's not something that your level of arousal meets with. Whereas if our level of arousal is too low, we'll go out and seek other behaviors to engage in to increase our level of arousal. Okay, so we also have theories of motivation that are based on incentive. Okay, so the first theories that we were talking about were mostly based on things that happen internally. Okay, so when we're talking about homeostasis, there's an internal biological change that we seek to fix, right? We seek to go back to homeostasis. With arousal, this is an internal need to have the optimal level of arousal. And instincts are something that are internal. Incentive theory, however, draws in both internal and external aspects of motivation. So incentive theory then is the theory of motivation, stating that behavior is directed toward attaining desirable stimuli and avoiding unwanted stimuli. Okay? So we engage in behaviors that we find rewarding. Okay? And we're more likely to do that behavior again, as you probably learned in the learning chapter. We're more likely to engage in that behavior again if there was a positive outcome. Okay? So for example, if you bought a lottery ticket and you won $10, you would probably be more likely to go out and buy a lottery ticket again, right? Because assuming that 10 bucks is a good thing and you liked having that, versus if you bought a lottery ticket and you won nothing. Okay, so there was no outcome, you paid your $1 or $2 or whatever, and essentially you lost your $1 or $2. So you would be less likely to go out and buy another lottery ticket. Okay? So incentive theory, it can also be influenced not only by external factors, by rewards, but it can be influenced by things that are going on biologically. Okay? So for example, food is more rewarding when you're hungry. Okay? So you would be more likely to go seek food, or you would work harder to attain food if you were hungry. So it's influenced not only by external factors, by the reward that you might get from your peers or from, you know, your teachers or something like that. It's also influenced by your internal state. So we also have a theory of motivation that's based on achievement. All of us have a certain level of achievement that we seek to meet. And so, and it varies for individuals. So some of us are driven to be very high achievers, and some of us are driven to, you know, not be as high achieving as others. So for example, achievement motivation would be in place if you're looking at someone who, for example, goes to school long enough to get a PhD versus somebody who's satisfied with just getting a high school diploma. Okay? So different levels of achievement motivation are involved in what you choose to do and how you pursue things in your life. Okay? So people who rate high on achievement motivation tend to work harder and more persistently on tasks, so it does influence your everyday behavior. And people who rate high on achievement motivation also tend to achieve more. So we have varying levels of achievement. It might be for different things, whether it's education, whether it's for financial success, whether it's for some other goal. But the higher we rate in achievement motivation, the harder we'll work for attaining these goals. So the theories of motivation so far have talked about meeting needs, whether it's a biological need, whether it's a need for achievement, a need for meeting goals. What about things that you do that you don't get any reward for from anybody else? Okay? So this is called intrinsic motivation, and this is goal-directed behavior that seems to be entirely self-motivated. So you can think about this as, for example, a child sitting down with a coloring book and meticulously coloring in the picture, and there's no reward for that at all. It's just coloring in the picture and staying in the lines if that's what they choose to do. Or, for example, people who do crossword puzzles. How many of you do crossword puzzles regularly? Okay, so you typically don't get any reward for those other than the sense of I completed that crossword puzzle and maybe some sense of accomplishment there. So the motivation there is completely intrinsic. And interestingly, what's been found is that when people do have behaviors that they engage in for intrinsic reasons only, if you were to start to pay them for engaging in that behavior, it would reduce their desire to do it. So say that you did the Sunday crossword puzzle every week, and you feel that you're really good at it, and somebody says, hey, I'm going to start paying you to do those crossword puzzles. You're likely going to become less and less interested in doing those crossword puzzles because it takes something away from that intrinsic reward that you get from completing that. All right. So in thinking about motivation and thinking about how we meet our needs, so we have biological needs, we have needs for achievement, we have internal needs that only we can really understand. We can look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How many of you have seen this before? Okay, so this is a pretty famous pyramid, this hierarchy of needs. And basically what Maslow said, he's a humanistic psychologist, and he believed that we as human beings work to better ourselves over time. Throughout our lives, we're working to become better people. Okay? But we can't do that unless we meet our basic needs. So in this hierarchy of needs, Maslow says that unless we can meet our basic physiological needs, we can't worry about belongingness and love. We can't worry about our self-esteem. So if you don't have food, you really can't worry about, we really don't worry about whether or not our self-esteem is high. Okay? And so until we meet our physiological needs, so feeding, having clothing, and our safety needs, are you living in a tent in the woods, or do you have a safe place to sleep at night? We can't worry about things like belongingness and love, or esteem, or self-actualization. Okay. All right. So, as I said in the beginning, motivation and emotion are closely tied together. For example, if you think about any time you've been hungry, you may have noticed that your mood is different, or maybe you have a roommate or a sibling. Every time that they get hungry, they get cranky, and you're like, you need to eat, so you stop this behavior. So we know that motivations and emotions are closely tied. Motivation can influence your emotion, and your emotions can then influence your motivation. Okay, so there's a bidirectional relationship between these two concepts. So emotions then are complex psychological events. They have several distinct components. It's important to know these distinct components. So we have a body response, or an arousal. Okay, we have to react some physiological way when we experience an emotion. And we're going to talk about the theories of emotion towards the end of lecture, and how it's thought that we have these physiological responses. We have an expressive reaction. So we have facial expressions, we have bodily reactions in response to experiencing emotion. And these responses are largely recognizable worldwide. Okay? If you look at somebody and you see a smile on their face, we know that that's happiness. And you can think about what would you picture of someone's face looking like if they were angry? Okay, a furrowed brow and not smiling. So we're able to recognize these things cross-culturally. And we also have a subjective experience. So that's the feeling of happiness, the feeling of anger, the feeling of fear. And that's a subjective experience that is specific for you. Okay. So we have, again, the body response, the expressive reaction, and the subjective experience. So we have defining characteristics of emotions. One is that they're temporary. Okay? Emotions are different from moods in that emotions have a pretty distinct beginning and end. Okay? It's different from being in a good mood. Experiencing an emotion it's a more discrete period than a mood is. Emotions are positive or negative. You have to feel something about them. It has to change what you were thinking or what you were feeling or how you were evaluating something prior to experiencing that emotion. Emotions are triggered by your thoughts. Okay. You have to think something about the emotion. Okay. So imagine that on the next exam you get a 75%. How many of you would be happy about that? Couple of you? Okay, how many of you would be upset about getting a 75 on the exam? Okay, so how you rate, how you feel, whether you feel happy or whether you feel sad about getting that 75% is based on how you think about your abilities in psychology, or how much you studied, or perhaps how well you did on the last exam. So, for example, if someone got a 50 on the first exam and they got a 75 this time, they'd be pretty happy, right? Versus if you got a 90 on the first exam and you got a 75 on the second exam, you'd be upset, likely, okay? So it's based on your experiences before and how you evaluate the situation. So the same event can happen. You could all get a 75, and some of you are going to be happy about that, and some of you are going to be sad about that based on the thoughts that you have about your abilities in psychology and what you've done before. Okay. Emotions can alter your thought processes. We know that negative emotions tend to narrow our thought processes or narrow our focus. Okay, so when something bad happens to you, you tend to close in on your feelings and focus on the problem or focus on the negative thing that's happening to you, versus when something good happens and we experience a positive emotion, we tend to broaden ourselves and be more open and more interactive with others, okay? So experiencing an emotion can alter our thought processes about how we feel about other people and other situations. Experiencing an emotion can trigger what's called an action tendency. So if you experience something negative, it may trigger you to become engaged in actions that will prevent that from happening again. Okay? Or if something good happens to you, it may cause you to become more open and more open to other experiences and that sort of thing. Okay, so it can trigger how we behave when we're faced with other situations. And finally, emotions are things that happen to you. So they're passions that happen to you. And we don't have a lot of control over when things happen to us that trigger emotions, right? We don't have much control over when we fall in love, or if we, trip on the sidewalk and we get angry because we tripped or embarrassed because we tripped. We don't have a lot of control over when these things happen to us. But we do have some control over how we interpret the situation. Okay, so imagine that your house burned down and you lost all of your worldly possessions in the house. How do you think you would feel about that? What kind of emotion do you think you would have? You'd probably be pretty upset, right? So you'd have sadness, maybe anger because someone, left the stove on or something that caused the fire. But how you interpret the situation, you could interpret it to be that at least no one died. Okay, so I lost all my stuff, but at least no one died. And that might temper the anger or the sadness that you feel about that situation. Okay, so how you interpret the situation and whether you decide to act or not on the situation can influence the emotion that you experience. So what about the brain and emotion? We know that processes within the brain determine emotional experience and emotional reactions. And the three areas that I'm going to tell you about, being the behavioral neuroscientist that you guys get this semester, are the limbic system, the pyramidal motor cortex, and the cerebral cortex. Okay, so we know that the amygdala within the limbic system is largely responsible for how we process the emotions of other people. Okay, so when we look at people, you can pretty much, you have a good sense of whether someone's friendly or whether someone's angry. And you can base your interactions with that person based on their facial features or their facial expressions. Okay? What's been demonstrated is that people with damage to the amygdala can't do that. So they could look at someone who's got a threatening look on their face. They look angry, their eyes are squinted, and they look like they're going to, be a threat to you. People with damage to parts of their amygdala don't understand that. They look at the person and they think the person's perfectly friendly and happy and ready to engage in conversation or something like that. Okay, so we need an intact amygdala in order to interpret the facial expressions of other people. Okay, and think about how if you couldn't see other people, how that might change. If you couldn't see their facial expressions, how that might change how you interact with them. Okay, we rely a lot on facial cues and body cues and things like that in order to interact with other people. Okay. The pyramidal motor system is interesting because it is involved in smiling. Okay. So we have the pyramidal motor system that is involved. You need that to be intact in order to smile voluntarily. Okay, so if you sit down and the photographer says cheese, the smile that you make is one that's regulated or that's mediated by your pyramidal motor system. Okay. If you don't have, if there's damage to your pyramidal motor system, you can't smile on command. Okay. Have you guys ever noticed that when you have a picture that someone said, smile, versus a picture of you naturally smiling, that looks different? Anybody notice that? Okay, if you look at little kids' pictures and their school pictures, their smiles are always like, that is not your smile at all, because it's based on the fact that different parts of your brain are making you smile voluntarily versus making you smile involuntarily. Okay, so your involuntary smile or your natural smile is governed by your extrapyramidal motor system. Okay. So people who have damage to their extrapyramidal motor system can smile voluntarily. If I tell you to smile, you can. But if I say something funny, or if you meet me on the street and you're happy to see me, you can't make an involuntary smile. Okay. So interesting little facts. So the cerebral cortex is also involved. We know that there are hemispheric differences in your cerebral cortex in how we process emotion. We know that the right cerebral cortex is involved in emotional processing. Okay. If you ask people to name emotions, so if you have people look at slides of people's faces and say, is this person happy, is this person sad, what is this person feeling, you see increased blood flow to the right cerebral cortex. And if you have damage to the right cerebral cortex, interestingly, you won't laugh at jokes. So it's been found that people with damage to the right cerebral cortex, if you tell them a joke and they think it's funny, they won't laugh, but they can tell you, oh, that was funny, I get the logic or the illogic, I understand what you were saying, but there'll be no laughter or smiling or any emotional response because of damage to the right cortex. Okay, so the brain processes emotion, and there have been some theories based on facial expression and emotion that one may influence the other, and one is called the facial feedback hypothesis. So this proposal says that muscles in the face deliver signals to your brain, and that your brain interprets the way that your facial muscles are acting. Okay, so your brain can interpret if you're smiling based on muscle movement in your face, and your brain can interpret if you're frowning based on the way that your muscles are and the feedback that goes to your brain about your facial expression. Okay. So some psychologists actually there have been some studies that show that this helps. So for patients that are depressed, they'll suggest that they smile. So make yourself smile, walk around with a fake smile all day, and you'll feel better because your brain is going to interpret that as that you're happy. Okay. There have been studies that have shown that this does work somewhat, and we'll do a little example, try to do a little example in a second. So what I'd like you to do is, if your birthday is in the first 6 months of the year, I'd like you to fake a frown right now. And if your birthday is in the last 6 months of the year, I'd like you to fake a smile right now. And keep it on while we look at this cartoon. Okay? So it says, whoa, that was a good one. Try it, Hobbs. Just poke his brain right where my finger is. Okay? So studies would show, so you can stop doing your fake smile, your fake frown now. But if I were to give you a survey right now, those of you who were fake frowning would probably rate that as less funny than those of you that were fake smiling. And plenty of studies have been done to show that is true. Okay, so if you're looking at something and you're smiling, you're likely to rate it as funnier than if you look at something when you were frowning, even though it's the same joke, right? And maybe it's funny or maybe it's not, but you're going to rate it differently based on your facial expression when you were exposed to it. All right, so we said that there are 3 parts of the emotional experience. There's the body response, there's the expressive reaction, and there's the subjective experience. We also know that emotions lead to physiological arousal. Okay, so when we have emotion, we have arousal of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, we talked about autonomic nervous system in Chapter 3. It's the fight or flight. You know, you see a bear in the woods, all these physiological things happen to you that you don't have any control over, okay? So when we experience emotion, we also have arousal of the autonomic nervous system. It's thought that arousal is adaptive in many situations, okay? So it's thought that, for example, it's good for us to get angry because then it teaches us to, or it encourages us to stay away from that situation later. It also, for example, if you think about getting yourself in a situation where you're in danger and you're scared, by starting up your autonomic nervous system and getting your body able to get out of there, that's an adaptive good thing that's going to help you survive. Okay. We also know that there are negative aspects of arousal. We know that we tend to perform we tend to perform more poorly when we're over-aroused or when we're under-aroused. Okay, so if we think about the motivation theories with arousal, we do tend to change how we perform on tasks based on our level of arousal. Okay, so this says if you're really stressed out, you're not going to perform as well on an exam as if you were able to manage your stress a little bit better. Okay, or if you were completely bored in a class, you might not perform as well on an exam as if you had been optimally aroused during that class. Okay, so we need to have that optimal level of arousal to perform at our best. And we also know that when we have emotional arousal, that our memory may be impaired. Okay. So in times of high stress or in times of fear, in times of anxiety, we tend to not remember things the way we would have if we hadn't had that emotional arousal. So the question then, are there basic emotions? You could probably describe 10 emotions right off the top of your head, right? But what's been agreed upon by most psychologists is that there are about 6 that are recognizable. Okay? If you think about words that we use to describe emotions, many of them mean the same thing. Okay? So you could think about anger. So someone's angry or someone's mad. Those really kind of describe the same type of emotion. So what we know is that there are about 6 that are recognizable, and these are recognizable cross-culturally. So there's happiness, sadness, surprise, fear, anger, and disgust. And these have a role in your basic happiness or your basic emotional experience, and also in survival, and we'll talk about specifically disgust in just a minute with that. So certain facial expressions then are universally interpreted the same way, even in widely distant cultures. Okay? So if you were to show a picture of someone smiling, a picture of an American person smiling to someone who's never seen an American person, they would likely interpret that as the person was happy. Okay? We know that these standard facial expressions and people interpret them the same way. Interestingly, it's been demonstrated that babies who are born blind, they still have the same facial expressions as babies that are born with sight. Okay, so it's thought that these are innate, that it's not learned that we smile when we're happy. So a baby that's born blind never sees someone smile when they're happy. They never see someone frown when they're sad. But they do those things, they make those facial expressions when they're happy or sad. All right, so I just picked these 3 out of the 6 to talk about a little bit more. So what do you think? Do you think that it's adaptive or that it's helpful for you to express anger? Okay, so there are a couple of ways to look at that. If you express anger, it might make you feel better, and then the anger goes away and you can go on with your day and on with your normal functioning. Okay, so that would be a good thing. But what happens if you realize that expressing your anger makes you feel really good, so then you express anger all the time? Okay, so you get really angry and you express that anger and then you feel better. You've learned that by expressing your anger, there's a positive result for you, is that you no longer feel angry. And so there's some thought that by expressing anger, we can learn to express anger more frequently, and that can become a negative thing. Okay. Happiness is the second one that I chose to pick out of the 6. Because we think a lot about happiness. There are all kinds of books about happiness and what can you do to be the happiest person and who's happier than who. And what studies have shown actually is that people are they have a pretty stable level of happiness throughout their lives. Okay? Studies have shown that happiness is not related to wealth. It's not related to what kind of job you necessarily have. It's more related to how you perceive the world and how the judgments that you make about what you have and what you are and that sort of thing. Okay, it's been shown that women and men rate equally on happiness. People who are in committed relationships tend to be happier than people who are not in committed relationships or have good, strong friendships and that sort of thing. And so really happiness depends a lot on how we compare ourselves with others. Okay. All right. Finally, I want to talk about disgust, because disgust, I think, is an interesting thing. Does this look like disgust to you? I mean, I don't know who this guy is, but he apparently isn't happy with whatever he's seen. And disgust, that facial expression has an advantage to us. So if you think about what would happen if you just took a drink out of a milk carton and the milk was sour, would you make this face, you think? So it's adaptive, because what's going to happen is the milk is going to dribble out of your mouth. Whatever got in your mouth will dribble out. You close your nasal passage, so you're not going to inhale any of the bad smell. And so this is a good thing. It helps us get away from, or keep toxins out of our system. Okay? So do you think disgust is learned, or it's something that's innate? So how many of you, if I said, somebody come up and take a drink out of this cup up here. How many of you would do that? Any? One person, two people, all right. So what if the person sitting next to you had a bottle of water and you were really thirsty? Do you think you might be more likely to drink out of that bottle if the person's a friend? Okay, so you don't know where that friend's been, right? You don't know necessarily where that bottle's been, but you'd be more likely to drink out of it versus looking at it, taking a drink out of this random cup of coffee, that's disgusting, okay? How many of you think that feces are disgusting? Most of you? Okay, so that's something that's learned, okay? So most babies, well, and every baby that I've known, and babies that we read about, they don't find feces disgusting at all. Okay, babies under the age, children under the age of 3 or 2 or 3, they'll eat candy that's shaped like poop. Okay, so can you imagine it? So if I gave you a box of chocolates and it was all shaped like poop, most of you would be like, oh, that's disgusting, I'm not going to eat that, even though you know it's chocolate. Okay, babies don't know that. They learn that from their parents' faces and from reacting to how their parents react to what they do. Okay, it's not uncommon for babies to stick their hand down their diaper and pull out what's in there. So they have no qualms about that. So some disgust is learned. By the time the kid realizes that the parent is disgusted, then they start to take on that disgust, and you can't change that. So a guy by the name of Paul Rosen, he's in your book. He did a number of studies on what people find disgusting versus what's not disgusting. For example, I believe there's a picture of a toothbrush with a cockroach on it. And even though it's it's a dead cockroach that's been sterilized, you ask people if they would brush their teeth with that, they'd know. There's no way I'm going to do that, even though there's nothing harmful about it. So those are the interesting studies on what we find disgusting and what we find not disgusting. All right. So theories of emotion. We're going to talk about 4 theories of emotion to wrap up this part before we get into motivated behaviors next time. Okay. So theories of emotion have taken into account what is the relationship between the subjective experience and the physiological experience. Okay, we know that, for example, when we're scared, our hands might shake, or our palms might be sweaty, or something like that. And we also know that we have subjective experience of fear. Okay, so the common sense theory is really a natural theory that says that we have a subjective experience and then we have a physiological reaction. Okay, my hands are shaking because I'm scared, or my I have butterflies in my stomach because I'm nervous, or something like that. Okay, so this is the common sense theory. I see a bear, I become afraid, and I tremble. Okay, that's the common sense theory. So that actually is not what's viewed as the top theory. And after the common sense theory came out, William James and another psychologist by the name of Lang came out, and they said that first you have the body reaction. So first we're going to have the physiological experience, and then we're going to have a subjective experience. Okay? So first my hands are going to tremble, and then I'm going to feel afraid. Okay? So they thought that the common sense theory was backwards, and that what's happening is that we have our physiological reaction, and we interpret that as a subjective emotion. So we shake, and we interpret that as fear. Okay? Do you see any problems with that? That kind of would require you to have a different physiological reaction to every emotion. Okay? And if you think about it, perhaps you get butterflies in your stomach before you have a big exam. What if you get butterflies in your stomach, the same feeling, before you go out on a big date with a new person? Okay, so the problem with the James Lange theory is that we have a lot of physiological experiences that have different subjective or different emotional components to them. Okay, so because of this fact that we don't have different physiological experiences for each subjective experience, Cannon and Bard developed their theory that says the body reactions happen with the subjective experience. Okay, so I see a bear, I become afraid, and I shake. Okay, so these things are happening independently of one another, but they're happening at the same time. The physiological experience isn't driving the subjective experience, and the subjective experience isn't driving the physiological experience. So these theories have one thing in common, in that they leave out the ability for you to interpret your situation. Okay, so we have the common sense theory that says I see a bear, I feel afraid, and that's why I shake. The James Lange theory that says I'm shaking, and that must be fear. And the common sense theory that says that it's all happening at the same time. Okay, and these things are independent of one another. But what about your evaluation of the situation? Okay, so this is an experiment by Schachter and Singer. And in this experiment, what happened was they had individuals take a drug that caused their heart rate to increase and caused them to sweat. Okay, so it caused physiological arousal. This person on top knew that he was taking a drug that would cause physiological arousal. The person on the bottom didn't know that the drug was going to cause physiological arousal. Okay? So then we pair that person with either someone who's very happy, so we have the euphoric accomplice, or we pair that person with an angry accomplice. And what happens when the person knew that the drug was going to affect them, they say, oh, those pills must be working, my heart's racing, my hands are sweating. When he's with the angry person, he still says the same thing. I'm having this physiological response because of the pills. Okay? When you look at the woman who doesn't know that she's taken a drug that's going to cause this response, when she's with the euphoric accomplice, she interprets that as fun. Okay? My heart rate's up, and I'm feeling excited. This is good. Okay? Same pill, she's with an angry person, and she's thinking, I'm getting angry just sitting here. So she's having the same physiologic response, but depending on which person she's with and her appraisal of the situation, that dictates what her experience is. Okay. So out of this, we have the two-factor theory. Okay. So this says that the cognitive interpretation of a body reaction drives the subjective experience of emotion. So if you have your heart rate increase and your blood pressure go up and you're excited and you're shaking, if you're experiencing that, if your cognitive interpretation is that you're excited, then you are going to have a different experience of emotion. Okay? Versus if you say, my heart rate's up and my hands are shaking because I'm angry, based on your cognitive appraisal of the situation, you'll have a different experience. So same physiological event can result in two different interpretations, or two different emotions, or multiple different emotions. All right, so just to put these four together, this is in your book, but it's something that you should be familiar with, is we have our four theories here. So we have common sense that says, I see a dog, I feel afraid, and then I have my body response. You have the James Lange, where first you have the body response, you have arousal, and then you have your subjective experience. You have Cannon Bard, where both the body response and the subjective experience are happening at the same time, and they're independent of one another. And then you have the two-factor theory, which takes into account your brain, and that you have a choice, and you have a role in determining what the situation is and what your emotion is going to be. Okay, so I'll stop there, and on Wednesday we will do feeding and sex and those sorts of things.